Following the resounding victory of his election at the midterm polls, the enigmatic President Rodrigo Duterte seemed to back away from his earlier campaign pledge to push for federalism. But are his statements to be taken at face value? Or are they simply a way for him to spark a debate on the issue and incite those in favor of charter change to come out in support of it? Recall that when he was considering a run for the presidency, he declined to be drafted several times. Was that a way for him to gauge the public sentiment in support of his candidacy? We know he eventually decided to run, and many said he had already made up his mind long before then. Is he working off the same playbook here? Is he gauging the public's appetite once again, this time in favor of federalism? Hi, I'm Doy Santos, and on this edition of The Cusp, we're going to be looking at the push for federalism and answer the question, is federalism fizzling out? Or is it just getting started? Right after the midterm elections, Senator Bongo, a close confidant of Duterte, quoted him as saying, "It would be difficult to get federalism off the ground due to a lack of support from Congress and voters in general." He was referring to a set of surveys conducted a year ago that seemed to indicate poor support for charter change and for federalism. One in particular, held by Pulse Asia back in June of 2018, showed that only about 3 in 10 were in favor of a shift to a federal state, with about 6 in 10 being not in favor, a clear majority, and 1 in 10 being undecided. But of course, that was then. Things might have changed by now. Of the 6 in 10 that rejected a shift to federalism back then, a little less than 3 in 10 were open to a change, quote, sometime in the future. And if you add that to the 3 in 10 who were in favor of the shift and the 1 in 10 who were undecided, then it could mean that up to 70% of Filipinos might actually back the shift to federalism now or in the future. This depends in part on whether they gain a better handle on the issue, with only about 3 in 10 saying that they had sufficient knowledge of federalism. Clearly, the public needs to be better educated first, because a plurality are either undecided or are open to it sometime in the future. Recall that back in 2018, the then Speaker Pantaleon Bebot Alvarez was making a lot of noise about charter change. In February of that year, he said that the timetable for shifting to a new constitution was before the 2019 elections. He even floated the idea of postponing the midterms if it was not accomplished by then. All of this may have caused Filipinos to shun charter change and federalism at that time. In fact, support for it seemed to wane between March and June that year based on the surveys. Recall as well that in 2018, the introduction of new excise taxes under the train law, coinciding with oil embargoes in Venezuela and Iran, conspired along with the mismanagement of the NFA's rice importation program, causing inflation to rise for most of that year. Even the BSP had to raise its policy rates, and that constricted flow of money into the economy. All this would have led Filipinos to want government to prioritize dealing with inflation first before turning to charter change. When Speaker GMA succeeded Alvarez in July 2018, she worked on rice tariffication to liberalize its importation and other measures identified by Duterte in his State of the Nation address, measures such as universal healthcare. In fact, within 6 months of assuming the speakership, GMA, who was on her last term in Congress, was able to claim that the lower house had passed all 15 of Duterte's priority measures. The two I just mentioned were eventually signed into law. The Rice Tarification Act came into effect early in 2019. This helped ease inflation, just as the price of oil, cooking gas, and electricity came down. The one-time effect of train had also passed by then. So, by the midterm polls in May this year, President Duterte's popularity had soared back once again. This resulted in the routing of the opposition candidates in the Senate and an increase of his ruling party in the House, as well as in local seats. So the question now is, why would the president back away from pressing home the advantage by refusing to take up the cudgels for federalism? The simple answer is, well, he probably isn't doing that. Speaking before a group of incoming local officials, the president lamented his inability to curb corruption under the 1987 Constitution and exhorted them to fix the current setup through charter change, even if they opposed federalism. He referred to the party list system that is open to manipulation by rich individuals as needing change, for instance. This came about because of some Supreme Court rulings that made that possible. Congress could, of course, override these judicial reviews by enacting a superseding law that would remove the ambiguity over who can stand as a sectoral representative. That person ought to come from the sector, for instance, such that rich billionaires could not represent security guards or workers, as they've done currently. While we're at it, why not also lift the cap on the number of seats a sectoral party can claim? Make it truly proportional and representative to avoid micro parties with very slim number of votes, rather, less than 2%, from entering Congress, simply because the quota of 20% for sectoral representatives hasn't been filled yet due to the fact that we've put a cap for any single party to have representatives beyond that cap. This would encourage micro parties to coalesce, so we wouldn't have such a large field. There were close to 200 of these party list groups at the last election. I mean, it was simply too hard for voters to sift through each and every one of them to decide which ones to vote for. These reforms that I've just mentioned can be done even without charter change, just an enabling law. In addition to fixing the party list system, did Duterte also mean introducing other political and electoral reforms? Like the separate election of the president and vice president, for instance, which introduces potential instability when the vice president is a member of the opposition, as in the present case. It opens up the executive branch to destabilization on the part of the opposition forces, on the one hand, and the pointlessness of the vice president's office when the president chooses not to assign a cabinet role to the person occupying it because they come from a different party, for instance. This particular change requires constitutional revision, as the current construction of the Constitution says that the vice president is to be elected directly by the people in the same manner as the president. Another area that the president cited had to do with decentralizing power from Imperial Manila. This, he said, needed to be addressed to allow for peace in Mindanao. He expressed dismay over the slow devolution of power to the Bangsamoro Autonomous Regional Government, which has just been established. The president earlier said that unless federalism was enacted, there would never be peace in the South. Of course, there are other options open to Congress that would achieve the aims of federalism in all aspects, short of calling it such. The research fellow Michael Yusinko of the Ateneo Policy Center offers a solution. He writes in a column for the Business World that local autonomy, quote, is a mandatory prescription of the 1987 Constitution. As per the framers, local autonomy under the Charter means, quote, a kind of maximum decentralization short of federalization. Article 10 has provisions that actually exhibit features of a federal state, giving support to the observation by federalism scholars that we already have a quasi-federal setup under the current charter. End of quote. It has been claimed separately by Paul Hutchcroft, a professor at the ANU, that the Philippines is already more decentralized compared to Malaysia, which is a federalist state next door. I would agree in the sense that we have adopted a form of fiscal federalism through the vehicle known as the Internal Revenue Allotments, or IRA, in the budget. The Supreme Court has already ruled that by 2022, the splitting of revenues by the government between national and LGUs must include all forms of taxes, like value-added and excise taxes, customs and duties, and not just income taxes. This would increase the vertical fiscal equalization and address imbalances in the way that devolved functions like public health is funded. The other way to improve this form of fiscal federalism through legislation is by introducing horizontal fiscal equalization, apart from the vertical national to local. Horizontal fiscal equalization means addressing the imbalances that happen when poorer LGUs are not able to fund services at the same standard. So under this setup, poorer LGUs could receive a top-up to compensate for the fact that either they're weaker in terms of revenue collection because they're less endowed with natural resources, or suffer other forms of disadvantage, and possibly have a higher cost of delivering services due to poor geography, a sparse but dispersed population, or simply have greater needs within their communities. This can be done by changing the way the IRA is split among LGUs. The way it's split now, currently, is based on population, land area, and equal sharing. Now, the determination of the formula could be assigned to an intergovernmental body that would decide on the best way for, lifting LGUs that are falling behind up to the same standard as the richer ones. The formula could be revised on an ongoing basis. The Australian Commonwealth Grants Commission, for one, provides a good institutional model for this. The EU and other federal countries have similar approaches. Another way to improve local autonomy would be to strengthen the role that the current regional development councils, comprised of provincial governors, play in regional development planning and governance. The only thing that can't be done without charter change is to establish regional governments with elected bodies that would take over the role of these RDCs. A simple insertion of a word in the Constitution could allow for regional autonomy with accountable elected governing bodies. Article 10, Section 1 of the Constitution reads that the territorial and political subdivisions of the Republic of the Philippines are the provinces, cities, municipalities, and barangays. There shall be autonomous regions in Muslim Mindanao and the Cordilleras as hereinafter provided. By simply inserting the word regions before provinces, cities, etc., in the definition of political and territorial subdivisions, this would allow for an amendment to the local government code that would increase or create the framework for autonomous regional governments, which would be supported by raising the IRA, for instance, to 50% of all revenue collected, including royalties on natural resource extraction, as proposed by the ruling party. Again, this would create a federal state without calling it such. It would also represent the smoothest, least disruptive way to get to federalism without overhauling the entire Constitution. We could work on incremental changes, amendments to the current Constitution, without overhauling it entirely in one go. This may be a better way. Congress could deliberate on each of the proposed amendments separately and pass them. Pass them possibly with a supermajority, as the Constitution prescribes for amending the Constitution. There would be no need to convene a constituent assembly or a convention. Simply, anything and everything could be proposed under those two modes. Under specific amendments, the changes would be confined to the scope of the proposed amendment. So again, in summary, there are several fixes that we can perform, on the 1987 Constitution that would address imbalances and grievances legitimately raised by proponents. These are the following. Number one, fix the way the president and vice president are elected, not separately, but in unison as a tandem, the way it's done in the United States. And do away with the inherent instability and wastefulness of resources under the current setup, where they're elected separately. Number two, return the party list system back to its original intent, which was to give a voice to marginalized sectors in society. This can be done through legislation alone, with a simple majority in Congress. Number three, improve the distribution of the internal revenue allotments, make them more equitable and balanced, and delegate the decision on how to do just that to an intergovernmental body. This again may be done through an act of Congress, not as a form of charter change. Number four, strengthen the role of existing regional development councils, or RDCs, again through legislation, and make regional governance more accountable and representative of the people through bodies elected by them. The latter will require a minor constitutional edit by naming regions as a form of political as well as territorial subdivisions of the country, followed by amendments to the local government code under which an additional 10% of the IRA to the regions could cover their costs. Finally, defining clearly the roles of each layer of government, the powers and authority they have, and the fiscal rules that govern their operation through the codes and laws that are adopted and implemented. So that's it. Finally, let me just say this in conclusion. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it is a duck. It shouldn't matter whether we adopt the name Federal Republic of the Philippines or not. The fact is, through these minor changes, the Philippines can become a de facto federalist state. In this manner, the original intent of the framers of the Constitution for local autonomy would be met. And it doesn't matter what label we put on it. This will be a uniquely Filipino invention. It satisfies the intent of the proponents of constitutional change in the ruling party, which is to evolve our own institutions and not simply import them from abroad. But it remains to be seen whether the administration and its allies in both houses of Congress goes for such a mode for improving governance in this country. Like I said, it might be less contentious and less disruptive to do it this way. As shown by surveys, the public is open to the idea of constitutional changes and even federalism being adopted, either now or at some time in the future. So let's hope that in the next 3 years, the electorate become better acquainted with the issues involved, and that some of these proposed changes would be discussed and a consensus arrived at to enhance the stability, accountability, and responsiveness of our government to better meet the needs of our people. After all, that's what this whole exercise should be all about. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed our show for today. This has been another edition of The Cusp. I'm Doy Santos. Thank you for listening.